You're watching Capital Connection from the Illinois State Capitol.
We want to express our most profound and everlasting gratitude to President Trump. How do you properly thank someone who's given you back the freedom that was stolen from you? He didn't have to do this. He's a Republican president. I was a Democratic governor. And doing this does nothing to help his politics. I'm a Trumpocrat.
The Trumpocrats, that's right.
If I have the ability to vote, I'm going to vote for him.
And joining us now is Republican Congressman Darin LaHood, who tried and ultimately did not succeed in persuading President Trump to keep former Governor Blagojevich locked up behind bars. Before we get into that conversation with the president, what did you make of the press conference, the homecoming press conference, and the remarks of former Governor Blagojevich comparing himself to a political prisoner?
Well, I thought it was ridiculous. I thought the president made a mistake in commuting the sentence of Rod Blagjojevich. When you think about in the state of Illinois, 4 of our last 9 governors have gone to federal prison. Not one has ever been pardoned or had their sentence commuted. You think about what Rod Blagjojevich did. He essentially ran the state like a criminal enterprise. I think there is no one that is less deserving of a commuted sentence than Rod Blagjojevich. So, and then we saw it yesterday. Someone that has never expressed remorse, never apologized, never said what he did was wrong, on being convicted on 18 counts of bribery, extortion, fraud, lying to the FBI. I mean, these are egregious crimes. And the other thing I would just say is, never once has there been an allegation there was misconduct on behalf of prosecutors, law enforcement, or the judiciary. This was taken all the way up to the Supreme Court. And at every appeal, they said Rod Blagjojevich was wrong. There was no appealable issue. He did these crimes, and he should be held accountable. So for all of that, I think this was a mistake. And as a former federal prosecutor, I've looked at the evidence in this case, followed the case, and he received the low end of the federal sentencing guidelines. People think this was
could have been 15 and up.
Yeah, he could have gotten 30 years under the sentencing guidelines, and he got the low end by Judge Zagel. So when I hear Rod Blagjojevich talk yesterday, I think he's in an alternative universe. And a Democrat told me one time, Rod Blagojevich is their Richard Nixon. In some ways, that's what I think of, and I think it was a mistake for the president to issue the commutation.
There's actually an old photograph of a young Rod Blagojevich getting an autograph from President Nixon. That was somebody he admired and looked up to. It's sort of an interesting changing reality. Now he says he's a Trumpocrat. He supports President Trump, says he has a kind heart. I want to get into that in a minute, but I want to single in on what you just said there. Was the totality of his crimes enough to keep him locked up for 14 years? Or how do you include the lack of contrition in sort of your calculus there of the degree to which he deserved to stay? Because some people have said, some reasonable judicial minds have said 14 years was a steep sentence. The crimes alone, as they were passed down, the sentence and all that, was that enough to keep him there for 14 years?
Well, listen, I think, again, you look at the substance of what here, you look at the merits of what occurred here. When you listen to those wiretaps of him shaking down the CEO of Lurie Children's Hospital for $50,000, I mean, this is
campaign cash.
Exactly, right. Yeah, for campaign cash. This is pay-for-play politics at its worst in a state that has a huge public corruption problem. You look at
withholding state aid in that call.
Exactly. You're not going to get state aid for your hospital unless you give me $50,000 for campaign cash. Look at what he did with the racetrack owner, what he did with the Hollywood executive. I mean, this is exactly what we are against here in the state of Illinois. The president talks about draining the swamp. Rod Blagojevich is the epitome of the swamp. And so when you look at the egregious nature of what he engaged in, the pay-for-play politics, put aside the selling of the Senate seat, him using his position to gain advantage is what is wrong with this system. And so Judge Zagel looked at the totality of those circumstances, and then he looked at, is this someone that is remorseful? Mm-hmm. Somebody that admits what they did is wrong? No, not ever. And so I think he got the appropriate sentence. And clearly when I hear him talk today, he hasn't learned from his mistakes. He doesn't think he did anything wrong. And I think that's just appalling for our state.
I understand impeachment has been litigated as it relates to President Trump, but from a matter of ethics and corruption and trust in government, compare those two instances for me. The shaking down of a children's hospital, saying I'm going to withhold state aid unless you help my campaign for re-election. I want to point something out. That campaign donation was never actually made, and the state aid was never actually withheld. In the case of the Ukraine call, President Trump saying, I want something that would effectively help my campaign, an in-kind contribution in investigating Joe Biden, withholding military aid in a state, Ukraine, that is currently in a state of war against Russia. What's the difference? The aid was never withheld or only delayed. It was ultimately delivered. The campaign contribution or the investigation was never delivered. Comptroller Susana Mendoza, a Democrat here, has said there's a lot of symmetry between those two acts. She thinks they're both illegal acts. How do you judge President Trump's actions there as it relates to what Rod Blagojevich did with that children's hospital?
Well, from a criminal standpoint, I think they're apples and oranges. There was no dollar amount tied to what the instance you gave with the President of the United States whatsoever. And I would just say this, you mentioned that Rod Blagojevich never received any dollars on this, but it's kind of like when the police officer pulls you over and says, I'm going to give you a ticket unless you give me
attempted extortion is a crime.
Exactly, and that's clearly what he did here. You don't have to have the crime to be fulfilled there to have that happen, and that's exactly what happened. And that's wrong, particularly when you're the governor of the state, the highest elected officer in the state. But that was repeated throughout this investigative process, and that was put forth to a jury. On the presidential side of things, listen, impeachment is a political process. It's not a criminal. There was no criminal violations that were brought forth by the Justice Department. There were no elements that were satisfied.
Because they can't. The Justice Department said we cannot bring a charge against a sitting president. That's what impeachment exists for.
But if you go back to the Clinton impeachment, lying under oath is a criminal violation.
Correct.
He violated those criminal elements. He was impeached before lying under oath. Same thing.
Taking a campaign contribution from a foreign government is a felony as well. That's
well, that wasn't a campaign contribution here in this particular case. I would also say this, at the federal level, when I think about impeachment, it's kind of the nuclear option, Mark. It's the last resort. It's the death penalty. Clearly the Senate analyzed that, and many of them thought what he did was wrong, inappropriate, maybe unconventional, but it wasn't impeachable offense. This wasn't something that was so treasonous or a violation of criminal statute to cause that to happen. So I think these are really apples and oranges.
Well, I think the punishment is also apples and oranges. Impeachment means you just have to leave office. Rod Blagojevich was put in a jail cell for 8 years, 9 years, I guess 8 years actually. But you mentioned that Rod Blagojevich, it's clear to you that he did not learn from his mistakes. President Trump to this day still says he did nothing wrong on that call. It was a, quote, perfect call in his view. Did President Trump learn from the House impeachment? Was there some lesson for him to learn? Should he engage in that behavior again?
Well, listen, I think it was a blatant political process that when going after the president, you had people.
But should he do that call again? Were you okay with that call?
Listen, if he was asking my advice on that, I wouldn't recommend him doing that call. I don't think that's appropriate language to engage in with a foreign leader.
But do you think he's learned his lesson? Do you think he's received the message?
Listen, I think yes, I do think the president will not be engaged in any more calls like that.
Very interesting. The president has also been engaged in a lot of other policy moves on trade, on the economy, and he's really sort of flexing his muscle, going back to the campaign trail, trying to get reelected again. How would you pitch Donald Trump? I believe you're still a delegate for his reelection in Illinois. How would you pitch his reelection to the voters in Illinois in 2020?
Well, listen, I'm actually the co-chair of his reelection here in Illinois, and I'm a proud co-chair. I didn't agree with him on the Blagojevich issue, but you look at the results that we've had in this country. Anybody that goes into the voting booth in November and asks, are they better off than they were 4 years ago? I think the answer of 90% of the people is yes. You look at the economy, lowest unemployment we've had in 50 years. There's more people working in this country than ever before. We've moved 8 million people off food stamps. Consumer confidence at an all-time high. The average middle-class family has between $4,000 and $5,000 more in their bank account. What does that mean? That means more money for putting gas in the gas tank, going on a vacation, buying a washer and dryer, getting a new backpack for your kid. It's real results, and that's been done with tax reform, a regulatory environment that lets the private sector flourish. So that's been strong. You look at trade, for instance. Our 4 largest trading partners in Illinois, Mexico, Canada, China, Japan. We now have trade agreements with all 4 of them, done under this president in a bipartisan way. I proudly supported all those. So whether it's our farmers, our manufacturers, our small businesses that trade, that is a good thing for the long-term viability of this country. And lastly, on national security, it took a lot of leadership to take out Soleimani, the Shia Iranian terrorist.
You supported that?
Absolutely. And taking out al-Baghdadi, the Sunni terrorist, right? Both of those were done by this president. They were bold moves, but they've made America safer. Eliminating ISIS has made America safer. So this is a president that's not afraid to take those actions to help protect this country. And so whether it's national security, whether it's trade, whether it's the economy, this president has real results.
You said eliminating ISIS, but when President Trump suddenly pulled back his support for the Kurds, those Kurdish fighters in Syria had to walk away from prison cells that were holding ISIS fighters, and there was a real concern that up to 10,000 ISIS fighters would essentially be reinserted and allowed to go back all over the Middle East and wage their terror yet again. In fact, your colleague, Congressman John Shimkus, said that felt like a knife in the back and a betrayal. And at that time, he said he could no longer, he said, remove my name from the support Donald Trump list. You mentioned President Trump has taken bold decisions. At times, do you have concerns that that boldness has gone across a line into erratic or danger?
Well, I don't. I think if you look at the team of military advisors the president has around him, from Secretary Esper at Defense to Mike Pompeo at Secretary of State, and General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, yes, and Gina Aspel, the CIA director, smart, bright people that come from the military that are giving good advice to the president on that. So, listen.
I never expected, though, that he would take out Soleimani. They said that was an option, maybe a nuclear option.
Well, listen, like all the military folks, they give him options, and he has to make the decision on it. Clearly, in my view, that was the right decision to make in terms of keeping America safer. Remember, Soleimani was personally responsible for the deaths of over 600 men and women in our military over the last 10 or 15 years. He had engaged in terrorist activities in Syria, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and in Iraq. He needed to be taken off the battlefield. The president made the decision, and it was the right one.
Did that decision get us any closer to bringing our troops home?
Absolutely. I think a safer, more secure Iraq and Syria helps us to bring our troops back. Now, we have to stabilize things over there. Soleimani was not somebody that was going to stabilize things there. So, listen, there continues to be tension in the Middle East, but keeping terrorists over there, and by the way, ISIS today has been eliminated. There are no more ISIS fighting over there because al-Baghdadi was taken out. President Trump has done that because of his military decisions.
ISIS fighters, people who were in those forces, exist today. They're still there. They're not organized in a way that maybe they were before.
You go back to 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, ISIS had taken over most of Syria, half of Iraq. That has been eliminated. They control no territory today.
We've seen even Illinois service members die in Afghanistan just in recent days. Taking all of it together, what gives you confidence that we are progressing or that we are any closer to bringing troops home from either one of those two fronts?
Well, in Afghanistan, for instance, we have been engaged in peace talks with the Taliban. That's been being done in Qatar, in Doha, Qatar. That's been ongoing for a year.
Can that include a Taliban involvement in their government?
Well, I think that's what we're trying to work out here. We're trying to figure out how we can get our troops out of Afghanistan, but to do that in a way that doesn't jeopardize the current government in Afghanistan. But just the fact that we're having those negotiations, we're talking to them, trying to reach a resolution. I'm skeptical of that with the Taliban because they're not really a trustworthy group. But at least having that dialogue and figuring out a way to bring our troops back is what we ought to be focused on, and the president's engaged in that.
We're watching a Democratic primary unfold right now, too, as former Vice President Joe Biden pitches himself as the senior statesman, a diplomat, someone who's worked with and encountered many other international dignitaries on the foreign stage and has worked that angle. I understand your father has endorsed Joe Biden, and I know maybe you and your dad have a disagreement here. You're certainly your own politician in your own right here, but how do you weigh that decision as you look at the field? Would you ever consider, or how would you evaluate Joe Biden as a president who could interact with other nations?
Well, listen, as I watch the debates, I think the nominee is going to be Bernie Sanders. I mean, he has all the momentum. He's won the first 2 states. Looks like he's going to win Nevada and South Carolina, and that looks to be who the nominee is at this point. I think Joe Biden has fallen by the wayside and clearly does not have the momentum moving forward.
You don't think so? But to Joe Biden's ability to interact and engage with foreign nations, give him a grade on that.
Well, listen, I mean, going back to when he served in the Senate or as vice president, I think he did an admirable job as vice president, but this is a whole nother level to be at. Running for president, this is 4 years removed from being vice president. And again, we're having a Democrat primary, and the voters clearly don't seem to be attracted to that argument or that narrative that you just gave.
give me the preview then. If it is Bernie Sanders the candidate, you seemed almost a little bit excited about the possibility that maybe he would be the candidate for the Democrats. Why?
Well, listen, I think freedom that President Trump talks about, and you look at the results, the points that have been put on the board with the economy, trade agreements, national security, and you talk about socialism, right? New Green Deal, Medicare for all, free health care for all. Who's going to pay for this? Taxing, lower, middle class, rich people. I mean, it's two divergent opinions on how government should be run. I think engaging in that debate of what socialism will do to this country, which I think we would engage. I'd love to engage in that debate on how that's going to affect this country. But I think people are very dubious and skeptical of a Bernie Sanders type of government.
Some of this jargon gets lost in translation, I fear, when we're talking about communism. That came up in the debate stage this week, socialism and Medicare for all. There's a lot of these different discussions. Medicare for all is an insurance plan, essentially, that is subsidized wholly by the federal government, but socialism is a very different thing, right? Isn't that the distribution and control of goods? Define for me how an insurance plan provided by the government, like Social Security or the VA, is socialism.
Well, I would just say this: if you look at Bernie Sanders and you look at his take or his philosophy on government, it is socialism, right?
Oh, he would argue that in many other aspects, but on Medicare for all specifically, is that government-provided insurance plan socialism, de facto socialism in your view, and why?
Well, listen, I think anytime you have the government involved with what could be in the private sector, or where you have government involved with all decisions that you're going to make, I think there's real issues with that. And I think most people think that. And the second thing is, how do you pay for it, right? If people want to have their own health insurance, if they want to make their own decisions, and instead the government is making that, I think that has not been a formula that has worked in this country. Socialism hasn't worked. We don't want to be like Venezuela. We don't want to be like Cuba. We saw what happened in Russia. We saw what happened in East Germany before the wall came down. Socialism, in my view, does not work. I think most people acknowledge that. Is there a role for government? Listen, I don't think as a conservative Republican, we're not in support of anarchy, but it's that balance of how government should function and treat people. And I think the more freedom and opportunity that you give people to make those decisions, the better.
And I think we're talking in some extremes here, anarchy versus socialism and all this, but in understanding the finer points of it, I don't believe Senator Sanders' proposal has called for the manufacturing or distribution of, for example, prescription drugs, or of a scalpel or a surgeon's device, or of hospital beds. All medicine, American medicine, would not be socialized. It's the coverage of it, the insurance of it. And he argues that right now the insurance companies are raking in massive profits, billions of dollars in profits every year, at the expense of people who can't afford their insurance.
Well, listen, I can't wait to have that debate and have Bernie Sanders defend his socialist views on this. I mean, that's what a presidential debate is all about. That's why we're going through this primary right now. And once the Democrats decide whether it's Bernie Sanders or not, I think that's a conversation the country ought to have.
So what's the Republican counterpoint? How do you get from where we are today to more affordable coverage for sick patients and for the population at large?
Absolutely. So what I've said is, and I think most Republicans support this, on prescription drugs, we have to hold the pharmaceutical companies accountable. Have they been ripping us off? Absolutely. And is there, so it's figuring out the level of government involvement with that, holding them accountable.
Price caps on drugs?
I think you need more transparency. I think you need to have
faster generics.
In some cases, absolutely. There has to be more options when it comes to generics. But I think transparency is the key. You also have to hold some of these drug companies accountable, and you have to go after the ones that have ripped people off. We haven't done enough of that.
With criminal charges? Or
absolutely. DOJ ought to be involved, and part of prosecution is a deterrent effect in holding those companies accountable. So that has to be a part of it. I think President Trump has talked about that.
And are you talking about the opioid manufacturers too?
Talking about across the board. Absolutely.
So for price gouging, or give me an example of how the DOJ should deter bad acts in the pharmaceutical
Well,
world.
listen, I think when you see examples of companies like the EpiPen or insulin, some of the companies that have been engaged in price gouging there, you got to hold them accountable. There has to be ramifications for taking advantage of people and ripping people off. We haven't done that. And again, I think this is a bipartisan issue. The President talked about it in his State of the Union address, got bipartisan support. both sides stood up. I'm supportive of, again, when it comes to pharmaceutical drugs, bringing down the cost. I think you can do that with the things that I just mentioned there. In terms of health care, listen, when you think about, I'm not a fan of Obamacare, but there's a couple things in there that work. Protecting pre-existing conditions ought to be in there. Parents being able to keep their kids on their insurance till 26 is a good thing. But you got to bring competition into the system. We don't have that now. Being able to go across state lines for insurance is a positive thing.
That was a big campaign promise of President Trump. Can you do that today?
Well, listen, I supported in the House a repeal and a replacement of Obamacare with that I just mentioned, going across state lines. Of course, it went over to the Senate. That's when John McCain voted no on it. My district borders Iowa and Missouri on my western boundary. I wish my farmers could pool their insurance with farmers from Missouri and Iowa and many other states to do that. That will help drive down costs. That's one key to it. But there are many things that we've looked at and proposed that will bring more competition into the system.
Fascinating. This is an election year. A lot of people are watching, and there are a few key races here in Illinois. One of them will be the replacement for your colleague now, Congressman John Shimkus. Who do you like in that race?
Well, listen, I'm more worried about my own race in the 18th district, and that's the one that I'm focused on now. Listen, John Shimkus served our country admirably, still does in the military and in Congress. That's a large district, 33 counties. I know we have a strong primary going on now, and we'll wait and see how the primary process works out.
Would you be okay with any of those candidates, be it Mary Miller, Darren Duncan, filling that seat?
Absolutely.
But no, you're indifferent to who?
Well, listen, I don't normally get involved with primaries. As the co-chair of the Trump re-election campaign, what I've said is I'm not going to be getting involved with primaries because my focus is helping to re-elect the president in Illinois, and that's what I'm focused on.
So the same would be true with the Republican primary to try to go up against incumbent Lauren Underwood, where we have Sue Rezin and Jim Oberweis, two senators dueling it out there, a few other candidates. You're
Listen,
hands off.
As I look at the 5 candidates in that race, 5 or 6 Republican candidates, I served with 2 of them in the Illinois State Senate, Jim Oberweis and Sue Rezin. Ted Grottel's a good candidate there too. Jim Martyr I know. So I think we have a good group running there. But again, let's let the primary process work its way the way it should. And again, being co-chair of the Trump re-election, I'm focused primarily on that.
So you're clear of the fray. We shouldn't expect to hear an endorsement from you in any of these races.
Correct.
All right, Congressman Darin LaHood, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mark.
We're back in just a moment with House Democrat Chris Welch, who's pushing to help student athletes get paid. He also weighs in on former Governor Rod Blagjojevich getting to go home.